Hello, welcome to a very special evening of Tisky Sow. For the first time ever, we're doing a double bill, 2 shows in one night. From 9 p.m, I'll have Ash Sarkar and James Meadway in the studio, where we'll be trying to not get too depressed about the serial liars and sociopaths who are running to be our next Prime Minister. Before then, a chirpier theme and fabulous guests. I've got Laura Pidcock in the studio, Shadow Minister for Labour, friend of the show. You've been on before. How are you doing?
I'm absolutely fine. Yeah, it's great to be here. I think last time I came, I was secretly pregnant. I hadn't told anyone, and I felt like my trousers were going to burst open on your show. So I'm somewhat more comfortable today.
Good to know. And as well as having a child, you have been planning the details for a new Ministry of Labour, which was announced in the 2017 manifest, but we haven't seen that many details yet, so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And you have been planning that with Professor Keith Ewing. You are Professor of Public Law at King's College London.
That's right, yep.
Also delighted to have you in the studio
much, yeah.
tonight. How are you both feeling about these leadership elections coming up? This debate, will you be watching the debate?
To be honest, I felt like it was so cringeworthy. I did watch about 10 minutes, and I thought maybe I should take more interest because could be policy announcements, but I just find it all very depressing.
They don't really do policy announcements.
Not really. They just tend to.
It's got better now. For the first in the sort of pre-campaign, that was when you really saw the kind of people they're trying to appeal to. That was when it was sort of like, let's not prosecute soldiers. Let's one of them was talking about abortion, weren't they? Jeremy Hunt was. But anyway, you can hear more about this at 9 p.m. Let's talk about the Ministry of Labour. So when we get a next Labour government, hopefully later in the year, who knows, you will be building a new department in government in this country, the Ministry of Labour. Why do we need one?
Well, that's right. So it was a commitment in the last manifesto in 2017 that we would have a dedicated department for industrial relations, for workers' rights, for trade union freedoms, and so much more. It's definitely understanding it, but I'm sure we'll come on to the detail in a second. And I think it was it wasn't just like a symbolic gesture from Jeremy Corbyn. He is, and I'm sure Keith will agree, this is one of his flagship policies, because we know, and why do we need this? We know that the world of work is broken for most working class people. If we think of young people at work, if we think of older people at work, those people trying to get a mortgage, those people renting at work, everyone is in some way being exploited. There is very low worker confidence. We have underemployment. So I think 1 hour contract counts as being employed in the employment figures. We have people who are working too many hours but still can't make ends meet, and we see precariousness, a whole industry created around precariousness. We see people who are, I heard of one McDonald's worker working about 40 hours a week, couldn't afford the rent to even rent a room. The economy.
I'm sure that's quite common, to be honest. 40 hours a week at McDonald's won't get you a room in London.
It won't. It just won't, and not even just in London. So we've got to a point where the government's national living wage, or the rate that people are paid for an hour, doesn't allow people to live even on a full-time contract. But hours are at threat. People turn up to work and their shifts are cancelled with no notice, and that person might have committed to a full day of childcare but have to go home because there's no work. So really, there is such little power now in working class people's hands that something like the Taylor Review that was announced by the government doesn't even scratch the surface in challenging some of the fundamental problems for workers, and I think it is one about power and powerlessness. We've seen for decades now the constant shifting of power into the hands of the employers, and I don't know about you, Michael, but I entered the workplace. I started my career in McDonald's, and there was no question that I would be, that a trade union official wouldn't walk into McDonald's, however many years ago it was. I didn't have any conversations with my colleagues about being part of a trade union. It is now usual for our generation below, and probably a generation above, that they don't work in organised workplaces where you have like a rep there who's introducing you to the trade union upon your induction, where it's just part and parcel in the fabric of the workplace. That doesn't exist. if you asked many young people what a closed shop was, they'd think it was like a shop that was shut. You know what I mean? Like, not that there isn't a compulsion, a requirement to be in the trade union, to work in a certain place. So all of this, requires not just tweaks here and there. All of this requires, a huge legislative shift, but also us to be really confident. I'm a working class member of Parliament, really confident that we can do this, and that there is the appetite out there from working people who know that they are working longer, harder, and for less pay.
So I mean, I think across the board, you can see a recognition now that workers have too little power. That's one reason why wages are so low, and that's one reason why the economy is a little bit stagnant. In terms of the Ministry of Labour, though, I was looking for the last time we had something called this, and it was 1968. So 50 years ago, we haven't had something called a Ministry of Labour. We've had things that do a similar function. I think they were called a Ministry of Employment up to about 1980, and then the whole thing was abolished. Is this a bit of a blast from the past?
Right. Look, you asked the question earlier. Why do we need
a
Ministry of Labour? Okay, so I would say to you, there are 32 million workers in this country. And what distinguishes this country, I think, from most other countries in the world is that there is nobody in government who can speak for these workers. So the purpose of having a Ministry of Labour with its own Secretary of State, its own government department, its own big civil service, is that we have a department which can speak for workers, which can represent workers. We have a Secretary of State who can sit at the cabinet table to represent workers' interests. And the point is very simple. In a sense, you said, you're right, we did have a Ministry of Labour in the past. And the question is, well, why did we have a Ministry of Labour in the past? And the argument from trade unionists in the past is that we needed a Ministry of Labour because business has its representative at the cabinet table. Farmers, agriculture, has its representative at the cabinet table, but who speaks for workers? And that is the whole point. It's about giving workers a voice in government. And from a voice in government to a voice in industry, and from a voice in industry to a voice in the workplace through their trade union. So it's very, very simple. It's not about connecting with the past, it's actually addressing contemporary problems.
So just to clarify, you said most countries have one of these.
Yeah.
So Britain's exceptional in not having a Minister of Labour.
It's absolutely exceptional. So in modern terms, you look at the great European democracies. Canada has a Department of Employment. You said rightly that we had the Ministry of Labour. It changed its name in 1968. It became a Ministry of Employment or a Department of Employment. So performing much the same function. But gradually its role has changed as governments, Tory governments in particular, have deregulated, stripped away workers' rights. They took away the department that was responsible for defending these rights. And what we're saying is that department needs to be reinstated. It needs to be at the very heart of government to represent workers' interests and to put workers' interests first. It should be the responsibility of all departments of government to represent the views of workers, but in particular, it should be the responsibility of a dedicated government department with its own Secretary of State to make sure that these interests, the voice of workers, is heard very, very loudly at the cabinet table and at the seat of government. So very simple, very straightforward, and very progressive.
What kind of technical question? When I was looking up what might correspond to this particular job, because obviously it doesn't exist in the current government. There's something called the Minister of Employment in the DWP, the Department of Work and Pensions. Do they stand up for workers' rights and for people in the workforce, or when I think of the DWP, I think of people punishing poor people and forcing them into work. I don't know if they also defend people in the workplace. I don't know.
Okay, there is a minister in the business department, who is responsible for workers' rights or for worker interests. And with the best will in the world, in a sense, it is a fact that workers' rights are represented by the Department of Business. The head of that department is the Secretary of State for Business, Energy, Innovation and Skills. So it's to that minister that the junior minister in that department is answerable. It is that minister, the business minister, who represents workers in government. And what we're saying is, well, look, that's got to change. The workers' voice needs to be represented by a dedicated minister who can speak for workers at the cabinet table.
So it'll be a standalone department. And I think it's right. The fact most people in this nation spend most of their time at work. I think it's quite unbelievable that we don't already have this.
Exactly.
It's almost unthinkable that the thing that affects people's health, their mental well-being, how much money they've got, whether they can go on holiday, whether the bailiffs are at the door, that hasn't got its own dedicated department in government. Well, just shows you really what the government thinks of working people. So it is extremely exciting. And I think I've been on a journey, because I think those people that say, oh, you know, you're taking us back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, all it is doing is trying to diminish the potential for power that this department can have, and say, we don't want to go back to those old days. Well, you know, young people now quite often do not know what a trade union is. That there was once a department that looked out for trade union interests. Look at that shift. Look at how successful, you know, that Thatcherite ideology was. And we're just going to meet that with equal measure.
So what are you going to do? I mean, one thing I can imagine, you're Minister of Labour in the next Labour government, and you're on the TV, you're talking a lot about people don't know about trade unions and how they work. I can imagine you being, you know, a great advocate, standing on Question Time, talking about why people need to unionise. In practical legislative terms, what needs to change? What are your priorities?
So we are, I mean, I don't think there's any secret, we are behind the scenes, every shadow cabinet member or shadow minister is working on preparing for government. I think it was like the first week of being an MP, people were like, be on a general election footing. So we have spent the last 2 years taking that manifesto and working on the detail, because we know whenever there's a general election, we will be under more scrutiny than we ever have been before in our lives, and we have to be prepared to answer every single question. So we have embarked on a full-scale consultation with the movement, with trade unions, about what are they coming up against that prevents them from effectively representing their members, organising and taking part in negotiations for collective agreements. What are the barriers for those trade unionists and for workers? And there've been so many common themes essentially that we need to speak to. So we're trying to bridge what are workers telling us, what are the trade union movement telling us, and then how can legislation speak to that? And what we've noticed is access to the workplace is probably the top concern of many trade unionists, that we might in law have a right to enter a workplace and ask to speak to workers or ask to speak to trade union members, but in practice it doesn't, you know, if you have a hostile employer, an employer that says actually, you know, it's not the right time for you to speak to workers because they're doing X or Y, or generally if people just aren't aware of why they might need a conversation with their union, that right doesn't really exist, does it, if people aren't able to exercise it? So
let's clarify, what is the situation now actually? So does a trade unionist have to invite, well, so if you're a worker in McDonald's, say, to get someone from, who is it the Bakers Union who represents them? So if you want the Bakers Union to organise your workplace, do you have to invite them in, or can you, as someone in the Bakers Union, just go into McDonald's and while you're ordering a burger sort of suggest that everyone joins the trade union? How does it work?
So things stand at the moment, the only person who can bring the Bakers Union into McDonald's is McDonald's itself. So if I work at McDonald's,
the boss? Only the boss?
Well, the boss could, maybe, but the boss is probably...
But the employees can as well?
But no, well, the company or the company's representative can invite the Bakers Union into McDonald's. But the worker has no right to bring the union into McDonald's, and the union itself has no independent rights to go into McDonald's without the consent of the owners or without the consent of McDonald's itself. Now that is very different from a situation that operates, you know, even in small countries like New Zealand, where the union has a right of entry to the enterprise in order to speak to workers, to speak to its members, to represent its members if they've got a grievance or a dispute with the company. So this is quite an extraordinary feature or omission of our system of employment law or labour law, that unions don't have that right, the workers don't have that right to bring people in. There are only very exceptional circumstances where a union has a right under statute to go into a workplace, and that has to change.
So how are they supposed to organise? How are they supposed to talk to people about their rights? Very, very, very simple things to say, like, we exist. You know, in reality, trade unions are locked out of workplaces. And we've heard situations of like general secretaries having to have meetings with members in car parks in January in a blizzard because the employer is so hostile. So clearly something has to change. Other themes that came up were trade union freedoms. Other themes were things like, I'll talk about the beating heart of the ministry, if you like, and that is sectoral collective bargaining, and often that kind of rolls off the tongue of some trade unionists, but if you don't mind, we'll talk about essentially what that means. And,
explain us from first principles what sectoral bargaining means.
And what, because and why we think it will have such a transformative effect, because essentially you will have entire sectors covered by collective agreements, and those agreements, so all of the aspects, so many aspects of a person's day at work will be bargained collectively by their representative trade unions, and employers will need to come to the table too. That's a world away from where we are at the moment, where you just, if you're lucky, you get a contract telling you what you deserve and don't deserve in the workplace. This will mean that workers and their representatives are doing it for themselves. And I know Keith might want to talk a little bit more in detail about how that might actually work, but just think about the transformative effect for something like social care that's been fragmented, privatised. I had a constituent come to me who, because at the end of the day, this is only going to be successful if this helps working class people and how much money they have in their pocket and what their experience is like at work. This woman came to me. She'd done like I think it was a 10-hour day, but was only paid for 5 because she didn't get paid in terms of journey times. We also hear of non-peripatetic social care workers who are being paid.
What is that? Sorry.
So like a peripatetic social care worker might be someone that just travels from house to house and goes in and does like a 15-minute visit. We don't believe there should be 15-minute visits, because what can you do in that time? We hear about these unwritten rules that if it's 15 minutes you really go for 10 because you've really got to get to that next person who's waiting for you. So all of this pressure is on the worker in those like residential homes, so where they are fixed in one place looking after people, and they might do sleep-ins, so they might sleep and be responsible for all of these sometimes very unwell people. That we know that one organisation was paying like £40 for the sleep-in. So by the time those workers had been at work 3 days, maybe done three sleep-ins, they were actually being paid in effect something like £2.50 an hour, because this idea that when you're sleeping in, you're like, oh, let me just go to bed and like, oh, I'll be paid £40 for the pleasure. It doesn't work like that. Some workers explained to me the other day, it's like a carer's ear. You constantly listening out, is everybody okay? And I did that. I did sleep-ins when I was a mental health support worker. And sometimes people would have difficulties in the night, perhaps psychotic episodes, and it's quite a stressful situation. The idea that you are not even being paid a minimum wage for that work is a disgrace. So you can see that having a collective national agreement would stop this race to the bottom in terms of all these different private sector organisations trying to undercut each other. If you are a social care worker, doing the most important work, by the way, the most important work that there is, if you live in concert, in my constituency, or you live in Coventry and you are providing that kind of care, you're covered by this national agreement that says this is what you are worth, and that has been bargained for by the worker and their trade unions.
So let's keep with this social care example actually, is to make very clear what sectoral bargaining would mean compared to right now. So my understanding now, if you're a social care worker, either you have to just take whatever terms and conditions your boss has independently set, or if you're lucky, your particular workplace might have organised in a trade union, potentially Unison or whatever, and then they can organise with that particular employer in that particular workplace for a set of terms and conditions. And what sectoral bargaining would mean is that whoever is the representative for care workers in Britain, the whole nationwide group of care workers would have a representative who's bargaining with whoever's representing all the nationwide care companies, and then they'd come to an agreement which would apply to all of them. So every care worker in Britain would be basically working to the same terms and conditions and wages.
Correct.
Is that correct?
So that is the standard.
Did I pass?
Yeah, you got 10 out of 10 for that. So that's the so that would be the standard form of collective bargaining that operated in this country until the beginning of the Thatcher era. It would be the standard form of collective bargaining that operates in most European countries at the present time. And the reason, basically, the way it operates is, as you explained, you would have a union, or maybe several unions. If there are several unions representing care workers, would sit down on one side of the table, and you would have the employers' representatives would sit down on the other side of the table, and they would negotiate an agreement which would apply to all the care workers in the sector. And some of the employers may not be members of the employers' associations who are taking part in the negotiations, but nevertheless, the effect of sectoral bargaining is that everybody in the sector, regardless of who they're employed by, is covered by the sectoral agreement. And the effect of that is it means you've got blanket coverage of the collective agreement across the entire sector. You've got a union presence in every workplace across the entire sector. You've got greater power for workers across the entire sector, and you've got better protection in terms of other terms and conditions, including pay, for every worker in the sector. So in a sense, it's a very, in terms of worker protection, worker rights, worker benefits, this is a very positive, progressive step forward. But it's not one that we are unfamiliar with in this country, and it's certainly not one that people in other countries would be unfamiliar with. And what has happened in this country is that the collective bargaining process has revolutionized over the last 40 years. It has diluted. We've moved away from sectoral protection with very grave consequences for workers involved. And we've moved away to an American-style model of collective bargaining, which is based on the enterprise or on the company. And that has a big effect in reducing the number of workers who are protected by collective agreements. It has a big effect in reducing union influence within the economy, and probably has a big effect in determining wage levels within the economy.
And why sectoral bargaining instead of... Because, one option, if your problem is people have got shit working rights and they're not getting paid enough, why not just raise the minimum wage and give everyone in the country really good working rights? Because with this whole sectoral bargaining, I know it's not just an idea, I know it's a reality in many different countries, but with this process, one risk I could see is that you've got workers who are in strategic parts of the economy who have lots of leverage. For example, now we know that train drivers are very successful at organising good deals, and then you have people who have less leverage, less power. So say, for example, fast food workers, even with sectoral bargaining, I could imagine they get a worse deal than the RMT, than the train drivers. Why not just raise everyone's standards instead of leaving it for each sector to work it out?
Well, I think there will be an uplift of statutory minimums. I think you've got to think about these things as building blocks. So there will be what the state provides, and of course every single element of what is statutory about employment rights will be looked at and fully costed, and what can you live on. And we've already talked about our commitments on the national minimum wage, and then the age segregation, the announcements that we made the other week. But then collective agreements build on that, whether at enterprise level or, at a national level. This is about the principle, isn't it, that it is the best people to assess what they are worth are the workers in that sector themselves.
I'm going to do a segue to a call out for money. We've mentioned the living wage. The national living wage set by George Osborne is a lie. He just renamed the minimum wage. We at Novara Media aim to pay ourselves the real living wage. That's only possible with your kind support. So please go to support.novaramedia.com and make yourself a subscriber. If you already are one, thank you very much. You're what makes this show possible. You're what's made this first double bill ever possible. As you know, our ask is the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, which at the moment will differ wildly depending on what job you have. But presumably in a Labour government, they'll all get a bit more similar. Wage compression is the idea, isn't it?
But the point about, I just make this point about the national minimum wage. It's not a national minimum wage. It's a national minimum hourly rate. Right. And it's not a pedantic point, because basically what it does is it sets the rate for the hour, not the rate for the week. And so how much your wage is at the end of the week or the end of the month will depend on how many hours you're able to screw from your employer. And that's what your wage actually ultimately is dependent upon. It's not the hourly rate which the government has set in this in the legislation that we introduced in 1998. So I think we made a big mistake we set the national minimum wage on the basis of an hourly rate, not on the basis of a weekly or monthly rate. And the fact is that the national minimum rate, however you rebrand it as a living wage, it does not guarantee
hours.
It doesn't guarantee an income which is sufficient for many people to live on. And that needs badly to be addressed. The way in which we calculate, conceptualize, calculate the national minimum wage, it has to be changed. So whatever we call it, we've got to change the way in which it's done.
I mean, that links well to my next question, really, which is about sort of like the changing world of work. So, I mean, one way you justify having a minimum wage, which is based on the hour as opposed to the week or the year, is that whereas when lots of labour relations or labour legislation was first made, we were in a context where most people had a 40-hour-a-week job or a 35-hour-a-week job in a stable workplace. That's changed now. So many people have more than one job. Many people work flexibly, including out of choice. Yeah. So, I mean, most people in Novara, we work part-time in a few different things. We'd love to all be full-time for Novara Media, but that's not quite possible yet, which means that we have to get part-time jobs, on the side. So this idea of going back to a society where people work 35 hours a week, they have that guaranteed income per month, per year. Are we looking at a society that doesn't exist anymore?
Well, I'm not sure we can just write off this concept of stability. It's what people need. And I think, I accept that people might genuinely want to be self-employed and that people will want to give their talent and skills to more than one place. And that's fine. But that is not what we are seeing at the moment. We're seeing these industries impose that precariousness on people who actually in reality could have stability of hours. There is the demand in the workplace that they could have a contract that said 40 hours. But
I mean, there's no reason why care work should be 0 hour, right?
There's no reason. There is no reason other than to shift the burden to the stress and the burden onto workers. So many young people that are watching this might be in the service industry, and they know that the stress when there is a dip in demand in their pub or in their restaurant isn't with the employer to, okay, let's calculate what we actually need for this, dependent on, what's happening in the area. Like, let's really strategically look at our demand. They know that they don't necessarily have to do that, because what they can do is they can just say to the worker, off you go, it's really quiet, you go home, and the worker loses out on the wages. And that stress, I don't think, should be with the worker. The responsibility, if you like, is for that employer to look strategically at how many hours that they need to provide. And somebody mentioned to me the other day, there'll be calculations all the time for how much food there is needed in the kitchen, how much sugar and tea and coffee. They can make that same assessment for how much work is needed in a week and lift that pressure off the worker to have to take all of the burden and all of the stress to just go home and lose out on a day's pay.
And obviously
it's a bit of a trope, though, to say in the past, we always had this regular 35, 40-hour week, and this is what governed everybody's lives. I mean, the fact is that many people worked flexible arrangements, that there were various forms of flexible working methods which have been operating over the last 100 years. And basically, there's a point that was reinforced when we did the consultation with a number of unions over the course of this exercise. A lot of these flexible working arrangements were exposed. I mean, things that did happen in the past. We've had agency workers in the past. We've had people on effectively on-call contracts in the past. But what distinguished the past from the present was that these arrangements were properly regulated by sector-wide collective agreements. And what we had was flexibility, but without exploitation. And that's what we're arguing for. We're not against flexibility, but what we want is flexibility without exploitation, with proper protection. So nobody wants to take away choice, where this is the genuine choice of workers. But what we are concerned about is to ensure that those who exercise that choice exercise it genuinely, and they don't suffer any penalties or disadvantage for doing it, and they're not exploited. Or required to enter into working arrangements which may not suit them. So it's about getting the balance right between flexibility and exploitation, and that's what we're working on in these proposals.
Obviously the narrative of this is that people used to have union rights, then in the 1970s There was a lot of industrial conflict. People turned against the Labour Party because they saw them as too close to the unions, and they saw this process of managing sort of the relationship between unions, employers, and the government. They saw that as breaking down. Then we had Thatcher attack it all. We've had a Labour government in between now and then, and they didn't rebuild any of it. So they'd obviously accepted the premise of Maggie Thatcher that the unions did have too much power, and that the only way we can have an efficient, productive economy is if we sort of keep them in their place. Do you think that's a correct analysis of New Labour, and do you think there was any justification for them to sort of come to that conclusion? It was popular, right? It was a popular conclusion that they came to. People agreed with them.
It wasn't popular amongst trade unionists, but I think one thing that I'm determined that we do with the Ministry of Labour in the build up to it and when in government is normalise trade unionism. I think every single report that you read now shows that the decline in trade unionism shows the increase in wage inequality, in wage stagnation, that they are a healthy and very good part of a functioning economy, if you like. Not just that it's justice for working people, it actually is a healthy part of society to have trade unionism. I mean, I know you'll have strong opinions from an academic point of view around the new Labour government. I don't know if you want to.
Well, let me just say this: that when I think 1979 was a big moment, I mean, politically, not just in this country but elsewhere. When I started work as an employee in 1978, that's when I had to go my first job. When I started work in 1978, I joined the labour force, and at the time 82%, now just remember this, 82% of British workers was covered by a collective agreement. And at the same time, about 60% of British workers were members of a trade union. Now 1979 onwards changed that. It was a big change. And I think the change that took place in 1979 was as big as the change that took place in the Keynesian revolution of the 1930s. It was a big political moment where, in a sense, the economic dial changed, and we adopted a new economic model which involved, as part of the process, the deregulation of trade unions and the deconstruction of employment standards. And that process continued all the way through the Thatcher major years. It continued during the Blair years, Brown years. Trade union collective bargaining density continued to follow despite limited support from the Blair and Brown governments, and it continued, of course, under Cameron and probably most recently under May. Now, what has happened, I think, in that 40 years has been as a result of the pursuit of a deliberate economic choice, a deliberate economic policy. Governments make choices, they implement policies, and I think the Blair and Brown government largely accepted the kind of Thatcher model, and they tried to give it maybe a human face, maybe tried to make it more acceptable, more tolerable with the national minimum wage, trade union recognition legislation, which was largely ineffective, perhaps a more positive relationship with European social rights, which some of which were quite good, but generally New Labour worked to dilute European social rights. So I think we've come to the end of this process. We've come to the end of that Thatcher-inspired move to deregulate and to deconstruct. The time is to take another big, bold step and to move in another direction, which is about rebuilding trade unions, about giving workers power. It's about equality. It's about raising wages. It's about improving conditions. And the only way by which we can do that is by restoring the role of trade unions in the workplace, in the sector, and in governments, and in attending to the problem of poor employment legislation.
And let's be honest, isn't this more important now than ever when we have workers essentially locked away in huge warehouses that nobody ever sees? We hear stories of people in huge distributors who are like weeing into bottles or miscarrying babies. Like, if this was a shop down the high street and somebody was like behind the till having to, wee into a bottle and it was in our face, people would be kicking off. Like, there is an invisibility about a lot of exploitation, and that's why it very much is up to the state, I think, to legislate against that, but also create the framework to allow trade unions to do that for their members. I mean, this downward trend in terms of how many, because I'm under no illusions, right, that a lot of this will hinge on trade union membership. Like, I think the movement as a whole are doing it now. We've seen, very positive figures about the amount of the increase in trade union membership.
Are there increases in trade union membership? Is it on up now?
Yeah, it is. I think it was something like 100,000, but don't quote me on the exact figure. But it's not on the downward trend. I think people know that
people know they're being screwed over now, right?
Yeah, they do. And but what we need to do is build on that and take it to the next step. So of course, be in a trade union because of that personal insurance system, that if something went wrong, we see quite high trade union density in teaching, for example, because lots could go wrong in the being in charge of so many young people. But we want to move beyond this personal insurance type incentive to be in a trade union, that you'll get a cheap will written for you, or cheaper car insurance or whatever. Those are important benefits for workers. However, we want people to opt into ideas of solidarity, of collective responsibility, of saying that together we actually can shift the balance of power and ultimately get victories in the workplace. We've had so many years of workers feeling deflated and defeated, and a Labour government will breathe a breath of fresh air into workplaces and the legislative framework to open that up.
That's quite a good slogan, breath of fresh air.
Breath of fresh air.
Final question on the Ministry of Labour, and then we'll move on to some other issues of the day. So many people on the left at the moment are talking about a post-work world. So in Aaron Bastani's new book, you can watch the interview about that from last week. He talks a lot about automation and the idea that many people's jobs will be automated away. He talks about, therefore, the need for universal basic services in books by Nick Cernick and Alex Williams, who've also been on the show. You can check out their interviews. They talk about the need for a universal basic income because automation is going to robotise people's jobs. Do you think that, within a decade, Labour win an election this year or next year, you become Minister of Labour, do you think within a decade your department could be somewhat irrelevant?
I don't think it'll ever be irrelevant, because the system will always try to exploit if we don't put in measures to prevent that. And what I mean by this is, I've heard some conversations about teaching, for example, and how teachers could be replaced with computers. And in my mind, we have to change the narrative on this. Why not have smaller classrooms if technology can aid and support teachers? Because there is an art to pedagogy. So you're right to mention this as a crucial point, and we had a whole consultation meeting on it with the trade union movement, that whatever happens in the world of work and the move towards automation, we have to make sure that there aren't that it is a worker's gain, if you like, that there is more leisure time, that there is more of the profits or whatever the victories that come out of these excellent technological advancements, that workers enjoy that it's not just left to people to that the wealth isn't just sucked up, essentially. And I think we've got a huge amount of work to do in terms of the Ministry of Labour, and because there are so many issues in terms of automation and making sure that not to get all Marxist on you, but that workers aren't just again an appendage to the machine.
There's nothing. We don't have anything against people who go all Marxist on Tisky Sour. That's very much allowed.
It's about making sure that workers benefit from this. I don't believe that work will be eradicated in the next 50 years. I just don't believe that. I think there will always be work, but of course, technology is replacing many jobs, and we have to make sure we will move towards the principle of full employment. That's very important to us. And through technology, workers need to make sure that they're not being further exploited and losing out on all of the profits.
I mean, that would be a problem. I mean, one thing people say it's difficult to automate is academia, but it would cause a problem for people in labour law if all the jobs disappeared.
But what I would say, just to follow up on that, is that to answer your question, is we've got to get to that future in the first place, whatever that future might be. And once we get there, we've got to manage it. And the principles that we're developing through the consultation process that's underway would actually help to manage any future that may arise. So that's important. Whatever happens, I think, what we are aiming to achieve, whether it be through new automation or otherwise, the key thing, I think, is three very simple things. One is that the aim through this process is to create a more equal society. Secondly, is to give workers some agency at the workplace in relation to their dealings with their employer. And it's to ensure that as work continues, that people have better paid jobs in more secure conditions. And whatever the future is, these will continue to be the three core objectives, I think, of a progressive Labour government.
But I do think that the wider Labour movement, not just the Labour Party, has to have a conversation about what are the minimum demands of the Labour movement, given that there will be further shifts and better technological advancements. We have to, have a gathering of minds, if you like, to say what are we demanding, and that's not all about the Labour Party and a shadow minister. For
quick fire. What are the demands? Okay, so 4-day week.
Okay, well, I tell you what my basic principles are. I want people to have more leisure time.
Yeah.
I want people to be less worried about their bills. I want people to have opportunity to be able to go on holidays, have food in their fridge, and all of that. Sectoral collective bargaining is,
so you get the 4-day week via sectoral collective bargaining.
Way, so you could belt and braces. You could have it both ways. So.
We can talk about
closed shop unions.
We can talk about how many days and
3-day week. Let's be ambitious.
But in all honesty, have we had that conversation recently? But if we think about Thomas Hepburn,
subscribe to Navarra Media.
The 8 hour, the 8 hour working day, 8 hours rest, 8 hour leisure time, 8 hours sleep. 8 hour leisure time. We need a 21st century conversation, and this isn't all about the Labour Party. This is all of the movement.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I'm going to take some of your questions. So start typing those questions, and while you do that, I have to apologise, but I'm going to bring up the big issue of the day we all hate talking about, which is Brexit.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's an impression that there's somewhat of a civil war going on inside the Labour Party. There's people lining up on different sides. You've got Ian Lavery, I think John Trickett, who are quite, and potentially Corbyn and some of his advisors who are very anti going full throttle in favour of a second referendum. Then you've got people on the other side, be them Tom Watson, who's gone to social media recently making some videos calling for a positive and ambitious, calling, or unambiguous, let's say, support for a second referendum. And then you've got sort of like a left-wing, love socialism, stop Brexit, hate Brexit, I'm not sure. And the Clive Lewises of the party, they're also getting very agitated in terms of we need to go full throttle for a second referendum. Where do you stand in this battle? Do you see it as a battle?
I definitely don't see it as a civil war. I think that's, over-egging the pudding a bit, isn't it? So, I
don't know. You're the one there. You can see what's going on. I'm just looking from the outside.
I don't think it's quite as dramatic as that. There are obviously, like there were in the referendum, strong feelings from people represent constituencies with hugely different attitudes. I'm from a Leave constituency. There are people, and I understand why those people voted Leave, and I understand why lots of people in my constituency voted Remain. And I think for some people, this has now become like an identity issue, hasn't it? As well as like a policy and a practical one about how they envisaged our relationship with the European Union. So I think quite a lot of these feelings run very deep. And I think there has been a few things that have happened recently and over the 3 years of negotiations that have led us to a point where the Labour Party does have to pause and reflect and think about what our strategy is going forward. We have this, really serious. Honestly, it turns my stomach watching the Tory leadership campaigns, because they are so right-wing. We have Donald Trump, who came over and made a very serious threat about the National Health Service. And really, if you're talking about the National Health Service, you're talking about all public services, aren't you? Being open to trade deals beyond our relationship with the European Union. There are material things that have changed. The idea that a withdrawal agreement cannot get through Parliament is a fact in front of us. And if the same withdrawal agreement came back to Parliament, it wouldn't get through Parliament, no matter if you're Boris or any other leader. So those things are very real. I think what has happened as well is, and I really dislike this because I think it's disingenuous, is many kind of hardline Brexiteers who are more of the exploitative form, like your Farages and stuff, are kind of positioning not having a deal as like the purest form of Brexit, and I do think that's disingenuous, and that somehow trying to get a deal is some kind of compromise or sellout. That's where we've got to, and I don't think those conversations are not happening in the Labour Party. There isn't. It's not that polarised by any stretch of the imagination, but those conversations are happening in constituencies. I have people, one person sent me an email saying, I said leave but not with a deal, and in that person's mind it was as if trying to get some kind of written document which establishes how we are leaving, not even the trade process and beyond, was somehow I was selling that constituent out. So I think there hasn't been an environment, and what I found really frustrating about the whole Brexit process, if you like, is that in the referendum and beyond leaving, I feel like there's been quite superficial arguments that have taken place. But there are really real feelings that are taking place in communities. So it is a hard sell, Michael, I'm sure you can imagine, to somebody who voted leave in a constituency like mine, in Crook or Contact or whatever, to say, vote for things to stay the same. But similarly, I know that many people in my constituency who voted Remain feel this connection, that I don't want there to be a disentangling of this quite long relationship that in their mind has created safety, that's created, better rights, better conditions, and some kind of European-wide framework to work from. So I don't see this kind of division disappearing in the next 10 years, to be honest, because we are going to be dealing with the ramifications in terms of legislation, but also in terms of our future relationship with the EU. I think it is right, though, that the Labour Party listens to its members, and thinks seriously about our way forward, considering those threats that I just pointed out.
Sounds to me like you're quite in favour of Labour becoming more unambiguously in favour of a second referendum.
I just think that, I mean, I'll be quite clear. I've found it very difficult and almost problematise a second referendum in the past, thinking, what would it say on the ballot paper? And those questions still remain in front of us. But Donald Trump talking about, taking our NHS and having it open to these capitalist vultures who care nothing about the health and well-being of people in my constituency, I can't stand by that.
Does it matter for the trade union? Does it terms of you've been planning in detail for this Ministry of Labour? Yeah. Does our relationship to the EU have any import on that a lot? I know lots of sort of. I sort of saw it as scaremongering, really, when people talked about if we leave the EU, then we'll lose all of our trade union rights, because it sort of, to me, treats it as if workers in Britain are a bit pathetic because we need this transnational institution to protect their rights. But you, as someone who thinks about this a lot, what do you think about us leaving? Does it fill you with dread?
What I would say is that the great bulk of our employment rights at the moment are EU driven and are there because of EU obligations. So, depending on the effect of outcome of future elections. I mean, if we have a Labour government, then the problem becomes much less significant. But if we don't have a Labour government, then you'd have to be worried about the future direction of employment rights and the lack of the removal of the European safeguards, which gives us a lot of protection. So we've got things, paid holidays, for example, would be at risk under a right, a hard right Tory government. We're going to lose our right of access to the Court of Justice, which is significant because a lot of the benefits, for example, the right of equal pay for work of equal value, is something that's been imposed upon us by the European Court of Justice. And whatever else comes out of the European Union in the future, they may well move in a more progressive direction than we would, certainly under a right-wing Tory government, heaven forbid. But if that were to happen, then in a sense we're going to fall even further behind. And alongside that, the other danger, I think, is that we do. If the Tories get their way, and we've got to make sure that they don't, but if they do get their way, we'll be into a free trade agreement with Trump's America or whoever replaces Trump. And the danger for employment standards is that you're going to have these American investors come into the UK, and they're not going to be too fussy about the employment rights or the employment standards or the employment conditions in this country. What they will want to operate the same anti-union practices in the UK that they operate in the US. So for labour law, employment rights for trade unions, there are some uncomfortable options in the future depending on political outcomes. So, in a sense, it's sitting on the fence on the political question that you asked. I think in answering that political question, we've got to be mindful of what some of the practical implications might be for some of the things that we actually hold dear and for some of the things that we want to develop and advance.
All right, I've got loads of good questions and 8 minutes, so we're going to do it kind of quick fiery.
Okay.
So first of all, actually, I like some of them are kind of personal, right? Peter Manuel, gig economy Uber app style teacher for a Chinese company living in Spain. So this is them. Do I have any hope from a workers' rights protected government? Will people who work in the gig economy on Uber-style apps teaching Chinese, will they be protected by governments in the 21st century?
Wow.
Yes.
What a question. The answer is yes. By a Labour
but you'd have to ask the Spanish government.
You'd have to ask the Spanish government. RH asks, which industries need to be nationalised? We've got the ones in the manifesto, I suppose. So are there any not in the manifesto that you personally think, probably they've been taking the piss? I suppose there's things you can do to companies if they're taking the piss out of the nationalism.
Public utilities, and then work from there. So.
Yeah, and I think social care is in a horrific state. And these are people who are looking after our children, our mums, our dads, this is a really, really hard job.
Yeah.
And I think privatisation of social care was, an immense failure. Yeah. And with real human cost.
Because undercutting in that is why people have these 15-minute visits that are actually just 10 minutes and why they don't have time to...
There's no point, is there, right? As much as it's for some people, it makes shotgun viewing on a TV programme to see members of staff abusing patients and being aggressive or violent or whatever. But there's no point just going, oh, look, there's a few bad apples. We have to look at the rotten barrel that those workers exist within. And that is one of pressure, lack of training, extremely low pay. Do I want somebody to be looking after, a loved one of mine who is stressed on very, very low pay that can't afford to pay the rent? But no, I want them to go to work fresh as a daisy, to take on that really complex care.
All right, this is a good question. Rory JL 2014 asks, should we support trade unions even if they take reactionary social positions or want to protect areas of the economy that principally we take issue with? So, in brackets, e.g. defence, nuclear... I suppose I'd add Heathrow expansion into the mix there.
Well, there's always going to be that conflict, isn't there, between people representing their members and things that need to happen. I've voted against Heathrow expansion, and I'm a member of Unite.
Did you get stick for that?
The union. No. They certainly made a call and went through why this was very, very important for their members. They have to do that. They represent, that branch, and that was absolutely right that they did that. I didn't want it on my conscience, given, the situation that we are in with a current climate catastrophe, but that, you know, none of us are beyond account, and I don't think the trade union movement would ever want that either. We challenge each other, you know, and I'm sure if I put one foot wrong, the trade union movement will say, you know, this isn't working for us for this reason or this reason, and none of us are above being held to account.
Yeah, the issue is the policy, isn't it? It's the policy on arms or on the environment or Heathrow, whatever it is. The issue, I mean, it's not the responsibility of the workers or the unions who represent the workers in these sectors. So my view would be wherever there are workers, they're entitled to be represented by a trade union, and they're entitled to be decently paid and properly looked after or represented by the union in question. So I think the question is starting at the wrong point.
HJB asks, can you ask Laura if the Labour Minister would cover unpaid labour? Because that'd be housework, caring.
I mean, there are some areas that are currently, and I don't want to say too much about it, but there are some areas that are currently unpaid that we are looking at. And what a fantastic point in principle. I wrote about that recently, about especially, you know, just having a baby or labour isn't valued, you know, and it is constant tasks that you do in the house. So it's an interesting idea.
All right, we've got 4 minutes left, so let's finish on that, actually. Stella Creasy yesterday wrote a widely shared, very powerful article, I thought, actually, about how MPs weren't guaranteed maternity leave. You've obviously just had a baby, I think 11 months ago. And you're also a shadow minister. I mean, you must be... I mean, that's a lot to deal with. How are you finding this?
I think it is... I mean, I thought that article that Stella wrote was incredibly powerful, and I think sometimes it's hard to give a bit of yourself that's painful to make a political point. So I do take my hat off to her for doing that, because, I mean, it is a bit ridiculous. Like, the system... I've talked about the system before. It is so ridiculous that, you know, you have to, like... You know, can I be paired for this? And like, you know, I've got this maternity appointment, and you're living in 2 places. So I live in Durham, obviously, and, you know, I'm taking my baby up and down. And but I think it's symbolic, isn't it, of the way women are treated at large. And I don't really like to talk about my personal position in terms of my baby and things, because I know that there are women like on, you know, significantly less money than me, having to do 2 or 3 jobs with that childcare in mind and like juggling. But I think Stella was certainly right to point out how ludicrous it was, and like, you know, the painful process that she went through, the idea that she couldn't take herself away for a few days and heal and recover, or a few weeks, if, you know, however long it took, is ridiculous. You know, but this idea that it's like a modern, you know, the reason those archaic rules exist in Parliament is because there are people with archaic ideas that do not, you know, probably still don't support the idea that pregnant women should be standing there, you know, heavily pregnant, and the speaker's quite good. I would bob up and down, you know, and think, this is bloody ridiculous. Why can't I just press a button to tell them that I want to speak? You know, the system, let's not forget that the reason these ludicrous women are put in, like Stella is put in these ludicrous positions, are because there are people in there, men mainly, that don't believe you should be a politician and a mother. You have to face that call. I went to see the leader, which was no longer the leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom, and said, honestly, this couldn't be more simple. Just let me give my vote to somebody else while I'm on maternity leave. I care about voting about Brexit. I don't all of a sudden want to opt out of this. It's not like another job. Of course I take it home. Of course I care what happens for my constituents. And, you know, she made it clear, well, there's been representations made that, you know, this will be a slippery slope, wouldn't it? You know, she was representing other people's views, of course, but, you know, people might want leave because they've got ill parents, or, I mean, shock, horror, you know, how ludicrous would that be if, you know, you've got care and responsibilities, you know. It's a privileged position to be in, to go in there, to work, to go home, to not have to care for somebody else. So it is, you know, it is 7 days a week. And God, if we can't have, you know, if MPs can't have some extra money in their budget, not for their personal bank accounts, I'll make that clear, to have somebody to cover them whilst on maternity leave, to take the stress off their teams, and to just be able to vote in your constituency.
we're going to have to end there because we've run out of time. And what a powerful point to end on. No, thank you for that. Thank you both for being on. That was a brilliant show. Always a pleasure to have you on, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming along, Keith. And we look forward to this Ministry of Labour when it comes into being. All the more reason to get a Labour government sooner rather than later. We'll be back in an hour's time. We're going to go watch the Tory leadership debate, have a beer, try and keep our spirits up, and we'll be back in an hour. I'll be with Ash Sarkar and James Meadway to give instant reactions to the shit show that's going to go on BBC One from right about now.